Without further ado, I'd like to introduce First Draft's U.S. Director, Dr. Claire Wardle.
Thank you very much. And hello to everyone for this day 3 of Infotheque. We're here to discuss an issue that's really close to my heart. This is a session that I pitched for us to have because it's something that I think about all the time. And that's the issue of misinformation coming from traditionally reliable sources. And we have got a great lineup to discuss this. We have Kelly McBride from Poynter, Jason Puckett from TEGNA's Verify project, Max Siegelbaum, the co-founder of Documented NY, Geraldine Azocar from Univision, and Ivan Oransky, co-founder of Retraction Watch and a professor at NYU's journalism school. This is going to be a pow session. We're going to get a lot done in an hour. I'm going to keep it going, and I'm going to hand over first to Kelly McBride. Kelly is a journalist, a teacher, and an ethics advisor to newsrooms around the world. She's a senior vice president at the Poynter Institute, a nonprofit journalism think tank and training center in St. Petersburg, Florida. She's also currently NPR's public editor. And one of the reasons she's on the panel is at the end of June, I read this great case study that she wrote up about an interview that was aired on NPR's Morning Edition, where the host Steve Inskeep interviewed US Attorney General William Barr. And I read it, and what I loved about it was that it talked about an issue, but it actually gave a lot of practical advice to journalists about how to prepare for this kind of content. So I'm going to hand over to Kelly so she can explain exactly what happened.
All right. Yeah, so the point of this case study that we're going to look at is that it really is on the journalist when they are preparing to interview a powerful official. And oftentimes you will know that a powerful official is going to try and deceive you and therefore your audience because they have done it in the past. So in the next slide, you'll see Steve Inskeep was preparing to interview Attorney General Barr. He had a 20-minute slot with AG Barr, and he did 2 11-minute pieces out of that interview, which is really a huge amount of space and energy and resources for National Public Radio. As he prepared, well, let's go to the next slide. And yeah, sorry. Here's the things that you need to know about this interview. He was going to talk about a bunch of different topics. A couple days earlier, the New York Times Magazine had published a story where Barr had made an assertion about mail-in ballots. President Trump had been making similar claims that mail-in ballots were not secure. And the other things that you need to know is that election experts believe that all US states have a secure mail-in ballot system, and that this is really a strategy to lay the groundwork for to contest the election results. So there's no evidence that mail-in ballots are insecure at all. In fact, there's a lot of evidence exactly to the contrary. The thing about National Public Radio is they have on their election security team some of the leading beat reporters when it comes to this topic, Pam Fessler and Miles Parks, who, full disclosure, is a member of my extended family. That's not at all why I became interested in this issue. In fact, he was a little mortified. However, they have been the election security experts around the country look at their reporting and say, yes, those people get it. They're doing a good job. They're informing the public.
Has an interest in the election, though. How does Barr see his role in making that election secure?
He says he's really concerned about foreign interference. Now that, Rachel, is obviously a bipartisan concern, but there's debate over what Barr is concerned about, interference with mail-in ballots. Some states want to lean more heavily on them because of the pandemic. The president has falsely said there's evidence of fraud in mail-in ballots. Massive evidence is what the president has falsely said. The attorney general knows that a lot of people have voted by mail in the past, but he questions doing so many this year.
I'm talking about a comprehensive rule where all the ballots are essentially mail-in, and there's so many occasions for fraud there that cannot be policed. I think it would be very bad. But one of the things I mentioned was the possibility of counterfeiting.
Did you have evidence to raise that specific concern?
No, it's obvious.
So he says he has no evidence, but that it's obvious there could be a problem. He's faced a lot of pushback here, as the president has, because there is a track record with mail-in ballots. Washington State, for example, has done elections almost entirely by mail for many years, and officials there say the ballots have various characteristics that make them very hard to counterfeit. In fact, the Secretary of State of Washington State invited the president and the Attorney General to come to Washington State if they'd like, and see what the security measures are like. I put that statement to Barr, and he said he'd be happy to call her.
All right, Steve, we appreciate it. NPR's Steve Inskeep with that sit-down interview with the Attorney General. Thanks, Steve.
Glad to do it.
So I took issue with this because even though Inskeep said that there was no evidence, what he didn't say is that there's a strategy behind this. And Inskeep had 4 tools available to him. So in my next slide, you'll see the first tool is preparing. So NPR had done all of this reporting. And in my next slide, as you prepare, you do research and you figure out what this individual has already said. Here's the quote from one of the editors at NPR saying, "We couldn't believe the New York Times let Barr say this," and then NPR let Barr say it again. In addition to preparing, you have to ingest the information, next slide, as if you could become the expert. Because when you're in a live interview with somebody who's super powerful, you have to go toe-to-toe with them. So you have to be able to spend the amount of time that you need to ingest all of that information. You have to write down your questions and your follow-ups. In the next slide, you'll see when you get to the interview, you have to think about and listen to the questions. So on the left here, you will see, here's the question that Steve Inskeep asked. On the right, there is Barr's answer. Barr says, "I'm talking about a comprehensive rule where all the mail-in ballots are, where all the ballots are mail-in." Inskeep doesn't follow up. Here's his follow-ups on the next slide. He said, "Did you have evidence to raise that concern?" Barr says, "No, it's obvious." Inskeep says, "Obvious that it can be done?" Barr says, "Look, we have single-dollar bills, right?" Inskeep agrees, but he never goes back and challenges him. So here are a couple of questions on the next slide that Inskeep could have asked. One good follow-up question would have been to go to those other states that Inskeep was aware of and then ask him. Every voter can check and see how their vote was counted. How would a foreign entity possibly disrupt that system? Another question might be, given that there are 5 states that currently conduct their elections by mail, what's wrong with emulating their processes, which have already been tested, some of them for 20 years? So in addition to preparing and listening very closely during the interview, once you get the information, you have 2 other tools available to you. The first is editing, right? Sometimes you don't have a great interview. You have to use your editing tools. So Steve could have not used the information at all. He had 5 other subjects that he talked to Barr about. Or he could have brought in an expert voice into the piece. And then finally, context is so important. So Inskeep could have told his listeners that as Barr was saying that really, in addition to there being no evidence, that it's pretty clear that that is a strategy for a fall contest to the election. So that as listeners start hearing that again and again, they start to understand why this person is spreading disinformation.
Thanks so much, Kelly. I'm sorry that we only had 5 minutes. And as a reminder to everybody, please put any questions for any of the panelists into the Q&A, and we're going to go to that at the end. But yeah, I've already got so many things I want to discuss. But anyway, time to go to Jason to give us more of a local perspective. Jason Puckett is an experienced reporter who currently leads TEGNA's Verify initiative. He's based in North Carolina and supports local TV newsrooms around the country. And we actually did some training with TEGNA journalists back in January, and everybody was saying, oh, the people that we used to go to, we can no longer rely on. So I'm going to ask Jason to give us a bit of insight into that.
Thank you, Claire, and thank you for having me. One of the cool parts of my job is I not only put together full-time fact-check stories, but I get to put on another hat on off days and sort of work with our local stations to identify how we can sort of incorporate the fact-checking mindset and systems into more general assignment daily reporting. And a big part of that and a big emphasis is how do you really vet sources, especially on a local level. And to follow sort of First Draft's talk of inoculation, I feel like if you expose an issue or a problem to the air, then you can help combat it more. Through our travel around, we've identified what we sort of call the bias towards availability. And as you can see on screen, that's sort of defined as the reality that in many local newsrooms, the best expert or source is not actually determined by their actual expertise, but by their availability to talk or for broadcast often go on camera. So sometimes that has to happen because of deadlines, but we propose ways to sort of start thinking about it differently now that you're aware that this may not be the best system. And on the next slide, I've laid out 3 things I like to cover that kind of help go towards that. So the first one is just primary sources. This might be self-evident to many. It's actually been my experience, especially in local markets, that a lot of people don't think they either have the time to research for the primary sources or that they can't somehow represent these primary sources. So a lot of times they just get an expert whose job it really is to point out primary sources. In some stories, in many stories, you can sort of cut out the middleman and just show your audience the primary sources. Those are typically more reliable because it's not someone you have to vet or research. It's coming directly from the source, specifically if you're talking about it. The caveat for that is in column 2, which is that's even, government sources, government websites, even in your local community can be changed, altered. There can be political motivations behind them. So one of the other things we say is that if you are using primary sources, take the extra time to check it in an archive like the Wayback Machine or something online. I promote that for almost every story, but if you're on your local Department of Transportation's page and you want to use a document that they've posted, take the extra minute to go to the Wayback Machine, put in that URL, and see if there is a version of it from 6 months or a year previous, and see if there's been any changes between that. If so, that's a great question to ask them why. It also could be a whole nother story about why they're changing information on their site and how that's updated. And then third, when you are using experts from your community or from a national level that's coming to talk to you, take the time in your pieces to actually justify why they are an expert. On screen, there is an example that we put in all of our fact checks where we actually have like a source panel on screen. We don't just say, I'm Jason, I'm the reporter. We talk to expert here at Johns Hopkins. They say this is false. We pause in the middle to say, this is a virologist at Johns Hopkins with this many years experience. This is the research they've done recently that's relevant to this. It just gives the viewers a little bit more of the context behind the scenes of why this person is trustworthy. And as you'll see in a second, it gives reporters reason to actually have to double check their sources. So the next slide is a list of questions that I always sort of recommend our local, especially general assignment reporters, print out and think through on any given story, particularly if they're doing a fact check. And to go through them rapidly, stop and ask, is this the best source or simply the most available, as we discussed? Can I find anyone reputable who would challenge this expert or source? Again, seems pretty straightforward, but if the answer is yes, are you actually talking to that other expert or giving them room to be involved in your story? Third, is there a primary source that can accomplish the same purpose? If so, do I need a middleman? Fourth, why is this source trustworthy, reputable, accurate? This is the point I like to pause and say, if your news director asks you this question and the only answer you can give is, well, they were the first one to get back to me, that's probably a reason to pause, slow down, look for another source, look for primary sources that can back them up, because that alone is probably not good enough justification to push them out as the main expert. And then last, this is really, really an old tenet of journalism, but questioning what it would take to discredit the source or prove your story's basis wrong. I mean, that's going back to having a red team or a B team who would come in and analyze a story and try to poke holes in it. In most local newsrooms, you don't have time for producers or editors to really jump in and do all that on every single story. So it's basically on you, the specific journalist's shoulders, to do it for your own stories to the best of your ability. Take off your hat, put on the opponent hat or the devil advocate hat and say, how could I question this source and how can I justify for those questions? And if you just pause and start having that mentality, especially in a deadline-driven industry, it can really help make sure you are putting up expert sources, or at least give you the moment to go, I can't answer these questions, that's a reason to pump the brakes and not just push the story through because the deadline demands it. On the last slide here, I broke down before my role as a full-time fact checker, I was just a general assignment reporter, part-time anchor, very, very deadline bound. Austin was the city I worked in before I was here. There are definite strengths and weaknesses to sort of having standalone general assignment reporters and standalone fact checkers. And something I think is cool about TEGNA that I like to share is that we're sort of trying to blend them. So a fact check story I do now comes directly after typically another reporter story, often on the same topic. I don't have to go through all of them because we're trying to move through this fast, but it's worth trying to think like a fact checker if you're a general assignment reporter. How do you get more data and focus on that data and not necessarily have to make the story the biggest part, but getting the information as accurately across and as justified. And if you're doing a fact check story, try to think about how to humanize that and make it really matter for your local audience. Those are sort of the things we push of like, if you focus on combining these and getting the positives of both and minimizing the negatives of both, you can really move towards better coverage and much better vetting of sources, even at a local level. And with that, back to you, Dr. Wardle, in the studio.
Thank you, Jason. Anybody would think you do TV for a living. Thank you for that. It was great. And I'm now going to move over to Max Siegelbaum, who is a co-founding editor of Documented NY, which is a non-profit newsroom that covers New York City's immigrants and the policies that affect their lives. And I know, Max, you have to talk to quite a lot of big institutions about immigration policy. And so I suspect you have some things to say about that.
So as Claire mentioned, we are an organization that covers immigration exclusively. And as we all know, immigration has become an increasingly partisan issue. Because of this, we're sort of stuck in the middle of this information war between federal and local authorities involved in the deportation system and advocates who are often a source of information. So, even the smallest stories become a point of contention where the truth is maybe never truly attainable, and you kind of have to write it as such. So in researching this presentation, this was a story I came across from a local jail where a lot of the immigrants who are arrested in New York City are held to await their hearings. And it's about how as you can see, amid a heat wave, detainees and their lawyers were saying that the air conditioning was broken and they were all, roasting inside the jail. When you read the story, you see the Bergen County Sheriff's Office, which controls the jail, says that's false. There are no broken air conditioner units in the jail. So kind of you're stuck in this position. Well, what are you supposed to do then? What is the truth? And we're constantly coming up against this problem. So in the next slide, I pulled another example of this, which kind of works on it in a different way. At the top of the screen, you'll see a screenshot from ICE's COVID tracker where they keep a running count of how many detainees have tested positive, how many are tested, and what the total detention population is. And if you rely on that, you would maybe feel the situation was going well. A lot of detention centers have 1, 2, 10, at most 50 detainees. But on the bottom, you'll see an article from an outlet in Minnesota, based in Minneapolis, called Sahan Journal, which is about how all of these detainees were reporting that they have COVID, reporting COVID symptoms, and how hard it is to get a test in the jail. So again, you see how kind of information can be shaped and modified to present a picture when in reality it's very different. And I think the important thing to remember is it's really just to be skeptical of everything. And on the next slide, you see an example of how we're able to counteract this. So in New York, there's a common problem of ICE arresting immigrants at local court hearings. And for a long time, the state courts were saying they weren't helping. This is a quote from an article, that they weren't assisting in any way. My colleague, Mazen Said-Ahmed, who's also a co-founder of Documented, was able to FOIA for documents that show this was not the case. In fact, a court officer had directly helped with an arrest. So these are just, primary source documents are really a way to counteract this issue. And on the next slide, we'll see another institution we cover a lot is the immigration courts. And what they have is a sort of guiding document, which is a set of data that kind of tracks every movement, every case, every hearing in the immigration courts. And this has been a sort of Bible for immigration reporters forever. But recently, the main organization that analyzes this data has been saying that the data is so bad that it's basically unusable. Their data keeping practices have rendered it unreliable and not reflective of the reality at all. So all of these institutions we rely on to report information are changing. And on the next slide, we can actually go to the next slide. So one of the ways we as an organization have sought to counteract this is basically to create data ourselves and not rely on anyone but our reporters. And this is an example of a project we did over the past couple of years where we sent reporters into the New York City's immigration courts to collect a standardized data set that we rely on in our own reporting. And resources are limited, but it was a very simple way of kind of getting a picture of how the courts sound and feel and what's happening inside, where we didn't have to rely on the federal government's faulty data, and we could just sort of create our own. So that is it for me. Back to you, Claire.
I'm very impressed that you had your own timer, Max. I feel like you're somebody who's training for radio or TV. I loved it so much. And also, I love when you put up the Excel spreadsheet. I was like, what is this going to be? I love it. I love it. You're like, we're just going to create our own data. So that's perfect. So now we're going to hand over to Geraldine Azocar, who's a multimedia journalist working as assistant news director for Univision, based in New York City. And I suspect you have some things to tell us.
Yes, I do. So when ICE comes knocking on your door, right? So earlier last year, President Trump started saying that he was going to send ICE to round up people and, deport them all to their countries. And so it did create a lot of panic within the immigrant communities, especially the Latino immigrant community in New York, which is part of the audience that we cover a lot, right? And so, how do you fight sort of misinformation and disinformation? So, we started doing a series of coverage and articles like this one, for example. The headline says, "What to do if ICE comes to look for me in my house." And it's basically telling people, what are your rights as an immigrant? What can you do, not do, and where you can seek help. And next slide. And so, and here's some of that broken down, right? If they ask you, ask them if they're ICE agents and what are they there for. You can ask them if they can show you their identification. You don't have to open the door unless they have a warrant signed by a judge. So there's all this kinds of tips or information for people to use. And I think a lot of people, in the next slide, please. A lot of people would say that this is advocacy, but we don't believe, and I especially don't believe that this is advocacy, because part of the disinformation was that the president really didn't have the capacity of sending thousands of ICE agents to round up people like he said he would, right? Then there's also, the sort of this claim that they were going to be able to deport them all. If we were really to deport every immigrant of the country, that would have a humongous impact on the economy. And so we sort of started breaking all of those things down. And I also don't think that you would call it advocacy in some of the other examples that I have in the next slide, because you're trying to fight either there's tons of information coming at you and it's ever changing, like it was with coronavirus. So because we're clarifying things and telling you what is right and what's not right, is that called advocacy as well? There's a lot of information also coming out about the pandemic and rent issues. There's millions of people who have applied for unemployment. I think the number today was it closer to 40 million people or something like that. So we just try to break it down. What are your rights as a renter? Can somebody kick you out of your home in the pandemic when both of the people in your house, or both parents or everybody in your household have lost their income. What are your rights on unemployment? Both the websites for New York and New Jersey started crashing due to the amount of claims that they started getting. So we were going back to both labor departments in both states, covering, well, what is the issue with the system? Can you get it fixed? And what are some of the common mistakes that people are making in the forms so that you can go back, correct it, and then finally get your unemployment checks, right? And a little bit is also with the police brutality story. It's, you know, the NYPD has a long history of secrecy about the disciplinary records. I don't think that covering that story, it's an advocacy to say that we're against the police or that we are you know, necessarily siding with the Black Lives Matters movement, but it's basically holding them accountable, right? Because there are disciplinary records. There are cops who have stayed in the force after certain incidents. And so it's our jobs to sort of clarify and break it down for our audience. I think that was my last slide. Oh, and then this one, this is not necessarily something breaking news, but it's also a complex issue that is worth mentioning. So we have a segment called A Clase con el Canciller, to class with the Chancellor, which we basically is done every Friday, and we break down the very complex New York City school system that serves 1.2 million students. And so, especially during coronavirus, right? Like, are they going to go back to school full time in the fall? Is it going to be half a week? Is it going to be virtual? When they started the virtual process, there were thousands of students that didn't have the income to get a computer or didn't have a tablet. So, and even though the public school system started giving them out so the students could have the tools to continue their education, it was just not possible for them to get it because there wasn't enough of them. So we also tried to break down, well, how can you get one if you haven't gotten one at this point and it's been 2 months since the pandemic started? That's it.
Great, thanks, Geraldine. And I felt like when you had the slide, which is like journalism or advocacy question mark, I was like, oh, we could have had a whole session just on that. So yeah, I'm sure we'll get to some of that in the Q&A. And so last but absolutely not least, I would like to introduce Ivan Oransky, who is MD, a Vice President of Editorial at Medscape, co-founder of Retraction Watch, and distinguished writer in residence at New York University's Arthur Carter Journalism Institute. And we were on a webinar, we've all been on a lot of webinars a couple of months back. And I was like, oh, Ivan, can you come and say similar things to this group? Because there's a lot to say about how do we report on medicine and science right now. Ivan.
Great, thanks, Claire, and really happy to be here. So I want to talk really just briefly, and if I had a 10-second version of this, it's the old, and you'll forgive me, Ronald Reagan, trust but verify, and that applies even to people who maybe in other circumstances we would think of as reasonably good sources and reasonably trustworthy sources, but in fact are, to be honest, maybe no more trustworthy than some other sources we're using, and I'll explain what I mean. So as Claire mentioned, I co-founded a site called Retraction Watch. We actually celebrated our 10th birthday this week on Monday, and took stock of some of the things we've learned. And one of the things we've learned is that retractions, and these are scientific retractions, so retractions of peer-reviewed papers that appear in, many of them in prestigious journals that we're supposed to think of as really they've been vetted, they've been what's known as peer review, and I'll talk about that later. But in fact, they're getting retracted about 1,500 times a year. And many of these papers actually involve clinical subjects, clinical trials, or scientific studies that may end up in clinical trials and may one day end up in treatment or in some surgery or some kind of drugs or just understanding a particular disease better. Of course, that's all quite relevant in terms of COVID and the current pandemic. And so we launched Retraction Watch really to keep an eye on this, because one of the things that science likes to talk about is, and scientists like to talk about, is how self-correcting science is. And so therefore the sort of presumption is that, or sometimes it's not even a presumption, it's stated, is that you can therefore trust science and scientists more than you might be able to trust, say, politicians or others or public officials who, you know, maybe don't trust but verify quite as much. And maybe that's true, maybe it isn't. I'd like to provide some, maybe on the next slide, I'll start to talk a little bit about how this really works in practice. So jumping right into COVID-19, we keep a page at Retraction Watch, or retractionwatch.com, but we keep a page on the site that keeps track of all of the retracted papers that are about coronavirus. So again, here we are in a situation where we want to listen to, you know, whether it's someone like Tony Fauci, whether it's some of the others who are obviously in government or not in government, epidemiologists, statisticians, people with sort of long titles and lots of degrees and lots of credentials. But in fact, what's really happening is that this is all speeding up. It's happening much, much more quickly. And so if you think about the way that the, you know, I'm from New York, and, you know, the way that that New York City had to prepare in terms of being overwhelmed, you know, there are always ICUs in New York City. There are actually a lot of them and a lot of beds, but, you know, that is sort of set up not necessarily for the capacity it would need during a pandemic. And so, you know, New York sort of got right to the edge of being overwhelmed, and some would argue maybe it did get overwhelmed. But the point is that things were happening much more quickly. Well, the same thing's happening in terms of science. So research people are rushing it out. I mean, again, with good reason. I mean, don't we all want a vaccine? Don't we all want treatments? Don't we all want to be able to leave our houses regularly, for example? But that means that things are happening more quickly and people are rushing. And of course, that means that they may make more mistakes. There's also, the stakes are so much higher. So people are actually watching all these papers. And there's these things called preprints, which you may have heard of, which are not actually peer-reviewed papers, but they're getting out there, especially nowadays, as if they were, you know, sort of peer-reviewed. In other words, looked at by a couple of experts before they were published, but they're not. That being said, a lot of peer-reviewed papers are being retracted as well. Some of the biggest ones you might have heard about, things like hydroxychloroquine and this company called Surgisphere, which had to have 2 papers retracted from the leading medical journals in the world, because frankly, it's not clear where the data come from, or frankly, whether they exist or not. And these were in leading journals. It wasn't just sort of somebody posting here, I think this is true. These actually went through peer review. So again, trust but verify. The fact that you see it and it looks like a paper, or it even is a paper, you know, these are the kinds of experts that, you know, some of the previous panelists were talking about. You need to trust but verify with them as well. And did things change? You know, you heard, you know, do the Wayback Machine or some version Internet Archive for, you know, your, was it local transportation authority? Well, do the same thing for scientific studies. Just because you read something that says a study said, well, what study actually said that? When you go and look at that study, does it still say that? Because it might have changed, it might have been retracted. If I can have the next slide, please, I'll talk a little bit more about some of my general tips. Never mind anything to do with even coronavirus necessarily, but obviously that's the theme, and that's the sort of the time peg, the news peg, if you will. And I just wanted to run through, and this piece is something I did for CJR, for Columbia Journalism Review, actually a couple months ago now. And I just want to talk very quickly. I'm going to run through these, but you can look up the piece if you Google CJR and my name, which is unusual enough, Oransky. You should be able to find it pretty quickly. It's the only piece I've ever written for them, so that's easy. One thing is, you know, always never be afraid to ask dumb questions. You know, a lot of reporters, especially if you are not used to talking to scientists, people with, you know, all this knowledge. I went to medical school, as Claire mentioned, so I guess I'm not terribly afraid of talking to doctors or researchers, but none of us really should be. You know, they wouldn't know how to, I don't know, fix my car, neither do I, but, you know, we're not afraid to talk to a mechanic, hopefully, so it should be kind of the same thing. It's important information. Don't be afraid to ask dumb questions, because otherwise you're going to end up with a notebook full of stuff that you don't really understand, even if you seemed smart. Some of the other things to think about are always quantify whenever you're writing about, you know, a study or a finding. A lot of reporters, you know, I hope this isn't too offensive, but went into journalism because they didn't like math. I get it, that's all fine, but you kind of have to use math, or at least have someone else use math and report that back. Because if you just say patients who took this treatment did better, that doesn't really tell you anything. And I see too many stories that say that. It's okay, patients who were given this drug, you know, left the ICU 3 days earlier. That's actually what happened, and that's still a good thing, but it's a hell of a lot different from nobody died, which is what did better. I don't know, it's closer to that. So lots of other tips in there. I won't, again, take time because we want to leave plenty of time here. So I'll just go to the next slide if I could and talk a little about the Association of Healthcare Journalists. So that's, I guess, my fourth hat. It's another volunteer hat, but I'm the president of the Association of Healthcare Journalists, and I just want to put that out there as a resource for everyone, for anyone really, who finds themselves on the sort of COVID beat, which I think basically all of us are now, and you've never covered science before, you've never covered medicine before. A lot of our content about COVID is actually free, open access, if you will. We have topic leaders in infectious disease, topic leaders in how to read studies, topic leaders in social determinants of health, which is another key factor here. We've seen more over and over that ethnicity, race, other social determinants, income, et cetera, have are correlated with how people do with COVID, and whether they're likely to be infected and whether they're likely to have a good or bad outcome. And so if you go there, and again, we have a special, you can find out more about membership if you'd like. If you just want to join for a little while, we have set that up for people who aren't necessarily going to be on the COVID beat forever, although it feels like we all are. But another sort of way to stay in touch with a lot of other reporters who are covering this, we have a listserv of more than 1,000 reporters who on a minute's notice can provide you with a source. You know, we're all trying to help each other. If you need to talk to an epidemiologist, if you need to understand what something means and you're on deadline, you send out an email, it goes to 1,000 people. Somebody's going to get back to you. That's really a pretty powerful way to do it, kind of not just have to study something and read it, but actually just get a source right away. So happy to have a conversation now, Claire. I think that's probably the more important thing than us continuing to go on. So thanks.
Thank you very much. We got through a lot of information in a short space of time, and so I'm grateful for everybody to keeping to time. We have a few questions. The first one, I'm actually going to take I'm just going to take it, which is, are fact-checking websites reliable to use as sources for stories such as factcheck.org, Snopes, PolitiFact? I would say it's better to take the information from those fact-checking organizations and verify yourself, because you can't just say all fact-checking organizations are made differently. And I remember when I was at the BBC, even if the BBC got something from Reuters or AP, they would do the checks themselves. And I think it's, I don't think we could necessarily rely on each other, even though it's a good tip-off. I think actually when you see journalists making mistakes, it's often because they're relying on somebody else has reported it first. So I just wanted to take that one quickly, because I've got a question for each of you. And the first one I'm going to ask Kelly, which is, I think lots of people saw the Axios interview with Donald Trump. And as a British person, I grew up in a culture where British journalists are brutal, to the point that sometimes I'd have to turn off because I don't like confrontation. And I think with the Axios interview, many people said, oh, you know, there was a technique there which was about follow-up and demanding answers. And I just wondered if you had any takes, Kelly, on that strategy and what lessons people could learn from that interview.
Yeah, I thought that was a brilliant interview, and the British audience and some Latin American audiences too are very accustomed to the journalists interrupting the subject all the time. Other audiences, and I know like when NPR journalists do that, people get really, really mad at them. So like, it just depends on what you're accustomed to looking at. I actually find that when you don't interrupt the person, that there is a better technique for informing the public, right? Because when you're interrupting the person, it actually just sounds like an argument. It sounds like both sides have equal things to say when they're stepping over each other. When you wait until the person finishes, if you've been listening and you are prepared, then you have very good follow-up questions. But you have to have done the preparation, and you have to listen to the person so that you can modify your follow-up questions to adjust to the very specific claim that he's making. And if you don't do that, I hear interviews all the time where their interviewer isn't listening. Yeah. All the time. And why aren't they listening? Well, normally they're looking at their time and what, if it's a live interview, what their out is, or somebody giving them the signals in behind the camera. Or even if it's not a live interview, they're not listening to what he's saying because they're looking at the number of questions that they've got to get through. And they're like, okay, well, this is good enough, or I already asked one follow-up. It doesn't work. And it really does. I think you really have to be willing to in the middle of the interview, so that you can listen, then have some dead space so that then you can gather your thoughts and transition. You just got to get used to that.
Yeah, no, I think it's training and it's confidence and it's experience. And I think right now we've never been in a time where so many people you're interviewing might be in real time lying to your face.
I don't know if that's true. I mean, that may be true. It may not be. They may have always been lying to us.
That's a good point. And Jason, I wanted to talk to you about, in the previous panel, somebody talked from the local perspective and said, I don't know how to report so I can get through to my fact resistant audience members. Is there an element here that just like, there's some people we just can't reach and that we should be trying to focus in the middle, or what do you think?
I think there is. I don't know how you measure that group. That's sort of something we've struggled with. You know, it's kind of that argument that the squeaky wheel, you know, gets the grease, and that's what you see a lot of the comments. We kind of, on bad days where we're getting a lot of negative feedback or people calling us liars or saying we're in the pockets of people, we sort of remind ourselves that the people who might be taking these facts to heart are not the ones who are then going to go comment on things. But I think where we've seen success and had good viewer feedback so far has been when we are as transparent as humanly possible in how we are getting to the conclusions we are, and where we can't answer the question. I think the more you acknowledge, like, okay, here's what this claim is, here's the sources we're using, here's what these sources say, and because of those sources, here's the conclusion. That's a lot different than just a typical reporter being like, the president made this false statement. You know, someone at home's like, well, why is it false? Why am I supposed to believe you that it's false? And then if you go the extra step and say, here's the parts we can't verify yet using our brand, or here's the parts we can't fact check yet, or that unverified or have no evidence, it shows the viewers at home that we're not like trying to force it into a truer, trying to give you as much factual context and behind the scenes as possible. But I mean, the short answer is yes. I think at the end of the day, there are just a certain group of people who are so buried in the, you know, their echo chambers, and that the amount of cognitive dissonance it would cause to sort of consider the other side is just too much. So those are the ones where it's like you do little stories over time that aren't necessarily going to trigger those, and maybe they build trust for you, and then they trust you down the line. There's just a bunch of different strategies there, but we've basically decided we can't gear our coverage towards the loud people who are never going to trust us. We have to sort of gear our coverage towards the more understandable, moderate person who's actually willing to look at the facts.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. It's very easy to focus on the people who are shouting the loudest. So yeah, great answer. Max, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about why you founded Documented. And as we've heard, obviously, in conversations over the last couple of months, you know, a number of newsrooms don't necessarily represent the diversity of American society. And that comes back to trust, which is, can you trust a newsroom that you don't necessarily think is telling the stories of your community? How does that play in terms of this sense of, you know, when you talk to reliable sources, does your newsroom feel like it's able to get different answers, and does the audience feel that?
I think we get certain probably the same answers from these sources as other news organizations. I think where we differ is we've built a lot of trust within the community itself, and that information is coming straight to us, and it's not filtered through press officers or lawyers or anyone else. And you know, the way we've been able to do that is just producing materials that are transparently aimed at helping inform these communities, which you know, need a lot of help and need a lot of specific answers and you know, direction to certain programs and so forth. But you know, I think I've always felt I've been treated more or less respectfully from federal authorities in our area. And I think they kind of get what we're doing, but also can sense that we have a pretty fair approach. So that hasn't been a huge issue. I think the trust with the community is more complicated and hard thing to attain.
No, I think you're absolutely right. And I think this sense of, simply because you have a newsroom that is maybe more representative of the community, that doesn't mean that trust is necessarily there. The flip is that we need to make more other newsrooms more representative.
Exactly.
So Geraldine, I wanted to talk a little bit about, we had a few cases during the police protests of, I don't know if you remember the Shake Shack story, which was the idea that some police officers had had a milkshake
Oh
poison.
yeah, we cover that.
Yeah. So like what happens there when kind of, the police are putting out a story, it's a great story, you're going to get lots of how do we teach reporters to slow down in that context?
Yeah, so it's funny because we had it in our morning show, right, which is 2 hours to fill. The information sort of came overnight, and I think the morning producer sort of put a video about that, and then by the time that it was time for the noon show, we knew that it was not true. So obviously we couldn't take back what we had done in the morning show, but we definitely stopped covering it. I think another tool that we can use for misinformation is not to amplify, right, that misinformation or the thing that's being said wrong. But also, on the flip side of that, we have to be extra careful when the sources are obviously government sources like the NYPD or a politician, and triple check the information that they're giving you, right? It's still up for debate whether there is a sort of a strike within the NYPD this year due to the protesting against police brutality, due to the fact that the governor signed a bill basically releasing their disciplinary records, which is now being battled in court. But, the numbers of incidents of shootings, of murders have already surpassed the number of last year, and we're only halfway through the year, right? And so we really can't sort of discern, we haven't been able to figure out completely, is that due to the fact that people were coming out of a pandemic and, a lot of people went a little bit crazy because they were locked up for so long, or is it because there's a strike? So you just have to be very careful. And I think another tool is, you don't necessarily have to be first. It's better to be right and wait on a story until you get it right than to try to go with something that you're not sure whether that you don't have all the information there that you've been able to verify with multiple sources.
Yeah, I mean, I think this belief that the police are on strike, it reminds me of the kind of the fireworks conspiracy too. I mean, we have these conversations at First Draft all the time, which is it this moment in time, we look at the data, there is more crime occurring, but we're in an extraordinary time. And how do you report on rumors that are circulating widely in the community? And how, all of these, I don't know, Kelly, whether you have thoughts on this, because it's definitely been a summer of these kind of growing rumors online, and how can newsrooms address them?
I mean, I have theories on this, right? It seems to me like everybody is spending so much time inside their own head that they're like the fireworks thing is great. Like somebody just thought of that. Somebody was like, I bet that all those professional fireworks display people are just selling them on the street now. The best story that I saw that debunked that was the story that said, you actually have to have professional launchers to launch those fireworks, that an amateur can't even launch those. That's how you know that story's not true. I think the thing that we have to do is stop. I mean, never, ever, ever share anything that you don't have firsthand knowledge of. And I know so many journalists, and I've been looking at a couple of individual journalists and just how much stuff they retweet, just to prove that they're aware that this story exists, right? You gotta stop doing that, because when journalists do that, it's not just like a citizen doing that. We have all this authority and you're just squandering it. So I think that's the first thing. And then I think the second thing is to just question everything. Like we don't know if anything's true, even around coronavirus, because science goes so slow, right? Science is slow, and so we question everything.
Yeah, and that, I want to bring in Ivan for the end here, which is, so last week we had a big week at First Draft because of America's frontline doctors and the people with the white coats on the steps of the Supreme Court. The heuristics, as humans, we're looking for these mental shortcuts, and a person in a white coat, I am just trained to trust. How on earth do we deal with, not only is what Kelly is talking about, which is teaching people that science doesn't have all the answers immediately, and secondly, how do we deal with these people now using YouTube, whether it's a pandemic video or America's frontline doctors? how do we help audiences understand that just because somebody's a doctor, that doesn't necessarily make them trustworthy?
Well, you know, Claire, as you mentioned, I'm a doctor, so I'm trustworthy.
I mean, I trust you,
so,
Ivan.
Yeah, yeah. I have a, I think when we were talking earlier, I mentioned I have an old lab coat, an old white, coat that I used to wear at the hospital. So I should have put it on just because then automatically trust me. But no, this is a serious issue, right? So how do you deal with the fact that people are actually using I would argue, weaponizing the sort of trust paradigm, you mentioned heuristics, right? How do you actually deal with that? And I think that what it comes down to is, again, I know I sound like a broken record and boring, but it's sort of trust but verify. Someone makes a claim. I actually don't really care whether it's the most partisan politician or a doctor who's actually a kind of a partisan, or like a scientist who I basically have followed his or her career forever and know that, they're very rigorous. I actually don't care who makes that comment. What I care about is, or makes that claim, I should say, what I care about is, they have the support to back it up. And what you'll find, of course, is that people have varying degrees of how much they're even willing to, or how much they seem to have. And now the scientist may give you a bunch of gibberish that's actually true, but that is unusable. The politician will do what Bill Barr did in the interview that Kelly analyzed, right? Which, well, it's obvious. Well, it's obvious. And so then somewhere in the middle is maybe a well-meaning person who has some credentials or doesn't. Again, I don't care about all that. So I would say don't get, sort of overwhelmed or, sort of retreat into, I must trust this person just because they have this, that, or the other. Almost do the blind thing. We see this actually in terms of people looking at resumes, right? I mean, there's sort of this awful, bias and racism that happens. And if you take the names off or the gender off, or you change the gender, all of a sudden, the same person who didn't get the job does get the job because of all these sort of implicit biases. That's actually true. I don't mean scientifically true, but at least sort of in a sense, true of, people who have degrees and letters after their names and all these things. So just what is the basis of what you're saying? I mean, to Kelly's point, science moves very slowly, and the honest scientist or the honest person says, we don't know yet a lot. And if you're talking to someone who never ever says we don't know yet, then there's a heuristic. If you want a quick, dirty rule, I wouldn't trust them very much.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I'm just going to say, apologize. We didn't get to all of the questions. If possible, we might try and connect you with people that you're asking questions about. But this is definitely a subject that we could just keep talking about. And we tried to cover a lot in a very short space of time. But thank you very much to all of the panelists. We have another session coming up now, Misinformation in Your Own Backyard. Details are in your email or your app. And then at 5 p.m., if you are still going and you can deal with another Zoom, join me for our closing session where I'm going to interview Stacey Marie Ishmael from the Texas Tribune. But thank you everybody for your contributions. I really enjoyed it, and have a lovely rest of your day.